Imagine a massive financial system where an oil tanker changes its name and flag right in the middle of the ocean. An electronics company suddenly turns out to be a middleman moving millions of dollars. Ordinary fishing boats sit near disputed islands for months, barely catching a thing, yet collecting government subsidies. A small oil refinery buys raw crude from a heavily sanctioned nation. And a local government builds highways and entire city districts using money that technically doesn't exist. At first glance, these look like completely separate stories, but they all share one thing in common. They all exist in the gray zone between the official economy, illegal business, and state interests. And this is exactly where China has learned to operate with terrifying efficiency. When you hear about China's shadow economy, you probably picture underground sweatshops, knockoff goods, illegal casinos, or suitcases stuffed with cash. But the real system is far more sophisticated. We're talking about dark financial networks, hidden debts, shell companies with untraceable owners, unofficial trade bans, dual-use ghost ships, and international payment schemes designed to bypass Western sanctions. The biggest question isn't whether this system exists. It does, and its individual pieces are well documented. The real question is this: is Beijing actually controlling this shadow machine? Or have they just learned how to use it whenever it suits them? Let's start with an important clarification. A shadow economy isn't always about crime. It can mean off-the-books workers, cash deals, informal loans, hidden incomes, shell companies, and financial debts that simply vanish from official state statistics. Studies give wildly different estimates for the size of China's informal sector, anywhere from 11 to 34% of its GDP, showing just how hard it is to separate a regular mom-and-pop shop from something truly hidden. And the Chinese economy is perfectly wired for these gray schemes for three specific reasons. First, the government strictly controls money moving across its borders. A Chinese citizen can't just casually wire large sums of money out of the country, which creates a massive demand for off-the-grid exchange and payment networks. Second, China's economy is built on millions of companies tangled in deeply complex supply chains, meaning a single product might be flipped between half a dozen middlemen before it even reaches the border. Third, the line between private business and the state is often completely blurred. A company might technically have a private owner, but it relies heavily on state banks, party officials, local governments, subsidies, and government contracts to survive. That's why the Western idea of a completely independent entrepreneur just doesn't always apply to China. But that also doesn't mean every Chinese businessman is a secret agent following government orders. The reality is somewhere in between. One of the biggest parts of China's shadow economy isn't hidden in a secret casino or a dark web bank account. It is buried deep in local government debt. For decades, Chinese cities and provinces were tasked with building endless highways, industrial parks, subway systems, and sprawling new neighborhoods. But here's the catch: they were legally banned from borrowing the money they actually needed to do it. So, they created something called local government financing vehicles, or LGFVs. 95 on paper, these were state-owned or quasi-state companies. They took out massive loans, issued bonds, bought up land, built infrastructure, and funded local government projects. Technically, the debt belonged to the company. But in reality, investors knew that if things went south, the state would step in and foot the bill anyway. What they built was a colossal parallel budget. According to the International Monetary Fund, by the end of 2023, the debt from these structures hit around $8 trillion, nearly 46 to 47% of China's entire GDP, with about three-quarters of these obligations sitting right inside the banks. The IMF even warned that a massive chunk of this debt would need to be restructured just so these companies could stay afloat. Then, in 2024, Beijing announced a 10 trillion yuan program to swap out some of this expensive, hidden debt for official, lower-interest government bonds. And this is a crucial detail. The Chinese leadership isn't denying the problem exists. They are actively trying to drag some of these shadow liabilities back into the light. But for decades, this exact system is what fueled China's explosive building boom and economic miracle. Local authorities could launch massive mega projects without ever showing the true cost on their official balance sheets. Banks confidently handed out loans, assuming an invisible government safety net was always there. Construction firms got their lucrative contracts, and Beijing got to show off brand new highways, ports, bridges, and endless cityscapes to the world. But this model comes with a hefty price tag. If a project doesn't make money, the debt doesn't just vanish into thin air. It rots inside the banks, local enterprises, and state institutions. That is why the first real function of China's shadow economy isn't global expansion. It is a time machine that allows the state to push its financial problems into the future and hide the true cost of its economic growth. Now, let's step outside of China's borders. Throughout its history, China has used an informal money transfer system often known as flying money. The genius part is that the physical cash never even has to cross a border. Imagine a guy in China needs foreign currency abroad, while someone else in the network just received a pile of cash in the US, Europe, or Latin America. Underground brokers simply match these two needs, and the accounts settle up locally inside their respective countries. Not a single official wire transfer takes place. Today, that ancient system has gotten a digital upgrade, looping in fake trade invoices, shell companies, crypto wallets, casinos, e-commerce stores, and endless burner bank accounts. Back in 2019, the FATF warned that illegal fundraising, fraud, corruption, tax evasion, counterfeiting, and underground banking were massive money laundering risks for China, while ironically, Chinese authorities themselves were launching massive sting operations against these very offshore networks. But the wildest twist in this story is happening right now in North America. U.S. law enforcement claims that some of these underground Chinese financial networks have started servicing Mexican drug cartels. In 2024, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted individuals in an alleged scheme that laundered over $50 million through structures tied to Chinese underground banking. But here is a detail that politicians conveniently leave out. Chinese and Mexican police actually collaborated with the U.S. investigation and arrested several suspects themselves, which heavily damages the theory that the Chinese state is running this dark web. Instead, it proves that Beijing is perfectly capable of crushing these networks whenever it decides they are a problem. According to the UNODC, Asian crime syndicates have turned underground banking, crypto laundering, illicit casinos, and online scam centers into a booming global industry. But when experts say Asian or Chinese networks, they are talking about the nationality and business ties of the criminals, not some proven master plan directed by the Chinese government. And this brings us to the first real red line in our investigation. The existence of these massive transnational networks is proven. Their use by brutal crime syndicates is proven. But the idea that Beijing is sitting in a control room pulling all the strings? There is simply no proof of that. The story gets truly fascinating when we enter the gray zone, where a business deal is perfectly legal under Chinese law, but blatantly violates American or European sanctions. Iran has been suffocating under economic restrictions for decades. It desperately needs oil buyers, ships, insurers, banks, and middlemen to survive. China, on the flip side, has a bottomless appetite for cheap, reliable energy. The result is a sprawling ghost market where the true origin of oil is scrubbed clean through dizzying chains of shell owners, mid-ocean ship-to-ship transfers, forged documents, and a network of small, independent refineries. In the US, these rogue Chinese operations are often called teapot refineries. Between 2025 and 2026, the US Treasury dropped heavy sanctions on a laundry list of Chinese refineries, port operators, ships, and brokers. Washington claimed these individual companies were scooping up hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars in Iranian crude, relying entirely on a shadow fleet to ferry it over. From Washington's perspective, this is a blatant evasion of sanctions and a vital lifeline for Tehran. But from Beijing's perspective, the picture looks entirely different. China officially states that it does not recognize unilateral sanctions unless they are backed by the UN Security Council, viewing trade with Iran as standard international commerce. Think about that. The exact same oil tanker is sailing through two completely different legal realities. To the US, it is a phantom ship fueling a shadow scheme. To China, it is just doing normal business that Washington has absolutely no right to police. 95 But the geopolitical fallout is incredibly real. Iran keeps getting paid. China gets its cheap oil and secures its energy grid. And America's ability to financially isolate its enemies starts to crack. The brilliance of it is that Beijing doesn't even need to officially build this secret system. All they have to do is ignore American restrictions within their own borders and shield Chinese companies from foreign pressure. It is not direct control over a shadow economy. It is the strategic weaponization of mismatched legal systems. Fast forward to the outbreak of the massive conflict between Russia and Ukraine, when Western nations immediately choked off the flow of microchips, machine tools, optics, and electronics into Russia. But here is the problem. Most of this tech is dual use. The exact same microchip can run a smart fridge, a factory assembly line, a surveillance drone, or a guided missile. A seller can easily claim they are just shipping harmless civilian goods. The buyer can effortlessly hide who the end user really is. And between the factory floor and the Russian border, there could be half a dozen cutouts operating in totally different countries. According to the US Treasury, in 2023, Russian imports of highly sensitive dual-use tech from Chinese suppliers hit an estimated $5.2 billion, a 40% spike in a single year. Now, this is an American estimate, not an independent global audit, but it perfectly highlights the scale of Washington's paranoia. US and European blacklists have repeatedly targeted firms across mainland China and Hong Kong, accusing them of feeding components straight into the Russian military-industrial complex or helping bypass blockades. Throughout 2025 and 2026, the European Union kept dragging more Chinese entities onto those very same lists. And once again, China's stance is the exact opposite. Beijing insists it does not supply lethal weapons to anyone in the conflict, that it strictly monitors dual-use exports, and that routine trade between Chinese and Russian firms is completely legitimate. So, who is telling the truth? The answer changes with every single shipment. Some companies are undoubtedly, knowingly smuggling gear to bypass the blockades. Others are just pushing civilian tech out the door, completely blind to where it eventually ends up. And some might be setting up elaborate front companies strictly to camouflage the final destination. But on a macro level, the outcome is uniquely profitable for China. Russia is becoming deeply dependent on Chinese goods, Chinese banks, Chinese shipping, and the Chinese market. Chinese businesses are sweeping up massive new client bases. Global payments are quietly shifting away from the US dollar and into the Chinese yuan, and Beijing gains immense economic and political leverage over Moscow, all without ever signing a formal military alliance or taking direct responsibility for Russia's actions. This is exactly how shadow or semi-shadow trade acts as a geopolitical weapon, executing state goals without a single politician having to declare them. But there is an even more secretive chapter to this story, and it involves North Korea. A 2026 U.S. threat assessment on the funding of weapons of mass destruction claims that North Korean operatives are using bank accounts held by Chinese citizens, dummy corporations, and debit cards to tap into the yuan and access the global financial grid. The report also flagged deep suspicions around the use of Union Pay cards and accounts sitting right inside major Chinese state banks. 95. But the specific wording here is vital. The U.S. called the Chinese financial system a vulnerability, a channel that foreign actors can exploit. That is a far cry from suggesting that China's banking giants are secretly taking orders from Pyongyang. The truth is, the North Korean economy is way too small and isolated to survive without external backdoors. China is its massive economic neighbor, acting as its one major window to the outside world. And Beijing has absolutely zero interest in watching North Korea collapse. A total regime collapse would mean a flood of refugees, chaos at the border, and potentially American influence expanding right on the Korean peninsula. So it is entirely in China's interest to keep North Korea exactly where it is. Weak enough to remain utterly dependent, but just stable enough not to implode. And these shadowy financial pipelines are exactly what maintains that delicate balance. But again, we have to be careful not to mistake a one-sided accusation for an undeniable fact. Most of this intel on North Korean smuggling relies on classified spy data, sanctions probes, and transaction mapping, rather than entirely open, proven court evidence. 95. But if you want to see the most blatant fusion of business and geopolitics on Earth, look to the South China Sea. On a radar screen, these vessels just look like a standard, harmless fishing fleet. But many of them are actually part of China's maritime militia. Technically, a ship might belong to a commercial fishing company and occasionally haul in some fish. Yet at the exact same time, it is being fueled by government subsidies, rigged with specialized comms, and given direct orders to loiter in heavily disputed waters. These ghost fleets create a massive, undeniable Chinese presence around contested reefs. They block foreign ships, escort the Chinese Coast Guard, and act as floating spy stations. Research by the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative and C4ADS actively identified 122 confirmed maritime militia vessels, with dozens more highly suspected, and satellite data showed periods where up to 300 of these phantom ships were constantly operating near the hotly contested Spratly Islands. This isn't a criminal enterprise or just an informal economy anymore. This is hard evidence of state funding, tactical coordination, and direct backing. 95. A fishing fleet has been transformed into an instrument of kinetic pressure, operating just barely below the threshold of actual war. If a collision happens, Beijing can just shrug and say they are just civilian fishermen. And if those ships successfully bully rivals out of the area, China quietly gains physical control of the territory without ever launching an official military operation. This model offers three massive tactical advantages. First, you can maintain this presence for years. Second, it is infinitely cheaper than deploying an actual naval armada. And third, it forces the enemy into a corner because it is incredibly hard to apply military force against a boat that legally registers as a civilian trawler. The maritime militia is perhaps the most terrifyingly effective example of a semi-civilian economic structure executing a hardcore geopolitical mission. But China doesn't just exploit the sanctions loopholes of other nations. It has engineered its own brutal mechanism of unofficial economic warfare. Imagine a foreign government makes a move that Beijing views as hostile. If China slaps an official trade embargo on them, that country can just take it to the World Trade Organization and fight back. So the punishment takes a much more invisible form. Suddenly, imports from that country start getting inexplicably delayed at Chinese customs. Bizarre sanitary violations pop up out of nowhere. Profitable Chinese tour groups simply stop arriving. Tech giants quietly drop their contracts and switch suppliers. And highly coordinated patriotic boycotts against foreign brands magically erupt across Chinese social media. On paper, there is no smoking gun, no central order. Every single hurdle can be perfectly explained away as a commercial dispute, a technical glitch, or just organic public outrage. Analysts watch this exact playbook unfold when Lithuania dared to open a Taiwanese representative office, with China deploying state-amplified boycotts and invisible embargoes to strangle companies that crossed Beijing's political red lines. Think tank analysts point out that it is a calculated chokehold. By selectively squeezing market access, China essentially forces terrified foreign corporations to do the lobbying for them, pressuring their own home governments into more favorable policies. This isn't a shadow economy in the criminal sense, but it is shadow economic diplomacy. The punishment is real. The financial bleeding is real. The political objective is undeniable. But the official sanctions? They simply don't exist. And this brings us to the ultimate question. The idea of a monolithic, omnipotent machine where the Chinese leadership micromanages every underground bank, ghost ship, crypto wallet, and shell company just isn't backed by reality. Chinese authorities are fighting their own brutal war against capital flight, rogue banks, massive frauds, and cross-border gambling rings. Their foreign exchange regulators regularly report sweeping operations to crush multi-million-dollar underground currency syndicates. Because the shadow networks bleed China too. They are the exact channels wealthy citizens use to smuggle their fortunes offshore. They are how corrupt bureaucrats launder their bribes. They are how scammers drain the savings of everyday Chinese people. They are how local politicians hide mountainous debts from the central government. These syndicates actively erode the state's absolute control. So, Beijing has absolutely no desire for total financial anarchy. But here is the genius of the Chinese state. It acts selectively. A scheme that drains money from the homeland and threatens internal stability? It will be hunted down and destroyed. A loophole that lets foreign corporations cheat Chinese laws? Closed immediately. But a shadow network that secures cheap oil, props up a vital strategic ally, hollows out Western sanctions, or expands Chinese territory in disputed waters. That is a completely different story. That doesn't require a top-secret mandate from the government. Sometimes, all the state has to do is lay down the framework, flash a few green lights, and offer the right incentives. The companies themselves intuitively know exactly where the invisible boundaries are drawn. Local officials know which violations will get them fired, and which ones Beijing will conveniently pretend not to see. The banks calculate the political odds. The entrepreneurs hire the fixers, 95. And if an international scandal erupts, the state has the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. They just claim a rogue private company was acting on its own. You could call this a system of weaponized ambiguity. Western media loves to paint China as an omniscient spider, sitting at the center of a web that controls every illicit network on Earth. Chinese state media, on the other hand, dismisses any investigation into these networks as a paranoid political smear campaign designed to suppress their rise. Both narratives are missing the bigger picture. The reality is far more complex. China's shadow economy isn't some supervillain agency with a shiny headquarters in Beijing. It is a living, breathing ecosystem. A chaotic mix of hardened criminals, brilliant entrepreneurs, local politicians, state enterprises, megabanks, street-level fixers, and foreign proxies, all operating simultaneously. Some of these players are blatantly breaking Chinese law. Others are only breaking foreign sanctions that China doesn't even recognize. Some operate perfectly legally on paper, yet they flawlessly execute the strategic goals of Chinese foreign policy. And others are just blind cogs in the machine, completely unaware of where their shipments are actually going. China's true superpower isn't absolute control over this chaos. It is the terrifying ability to instantly separate the useful elements from the toxic ones. Beijing ruthlessly polices its internal shadows, but the external gray zone? That is used as a highly effective buffer, insulating the state from deeply risky geopolitical operations. It provides perfect plausible deniability. It completely avoids direct military confrontation. It drastically lowers the financial cost of projecting power. And it forces their adversaries into an exhausting trap. You have to prove not just that a dirty deal happened, but that a high-ranking official actually ordered it. China's shadow economy is not some secret empire locked inside a subterranean bunker. It is hiding right in plain sight. You'll find it buried in the toxic debt of local shell companies, shipping manifests, in the smog of independent oil refineries, in untraceable accounts opened by nameless middlemen, in rusty fishing trawlers aggressively guarding tropical reefs, in microchips labeled as civilian tech, in invisible boycotts, and in the massive exploitable canyon between what Washington calls illegal and what Beijing calls entirely legitimate. The loudest, most sensational accusations that the Chinese state is running a global criminal syndicate remain completely unproven. But something else has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. China has engineered a hybrid economic machine where the state, private capital, and the criminal underworld can seamlessly overlap without any hard borders. And when that overlap aligns with national interests, it transforms into a devastating geopolitical weapon. Unofficial, highly adaptable, incredibly cheap, and draped in enough ambiguity that absolutely no one can say for sure where private business ends and state strategy begins. In the 21st century, superpowers don't just fight with aircraft carriers, hypersonic missiles, or angry diplomatic protests. They fight with deep-water ports, toxic loans, burner bank accounts, illicit oil discounts, forged shipping containers, and civilian ghost fleets. And China, better than almost anyone else, has mastered the golden rule of this new geopolitics. The most effective weapon you can wield is the one your enemy can never completely prove